the retired military K9, never barked. He never growled, he didn't bare his teeth when two hospital security officers grabbed the nurse by the arm and ordered her out of the emergency room. Instead, the old German shepherd did something that froze every doctor, every patient, and every veteran in the waiting room. He slowly stood, walked to the automatic exit doors, sat directly in front of them, and refused to let his nurse leave. No one understood why, not the hospital director, not the security officers, not even the nurse who had loved him for the past 6 years. But 20 minutes later, a quiet elderly man would walk into that same emergency room, look at the old dog, and whisper 5 words that hadn't been spoken in nearly a decade. The moment the German shepherd heard them, everything changed. Before we continue, if stories of loyalty, courage, and forgotten heroes inspire you, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to see how far Duke's story travels around the world. The automatic doors of Jefferson Memorial Medical Center slid open every few seconds as ambulances, worried families, and exhausted nurses moved through another busy Monday morning. For most people, it was just another hospital. For Emily Carter, it had become the only place where she still felt she belonged. She arrived every morning at exactly 6:35. Not because her shift started then. Her shift didn't begin until 7. She came early because someone else insisted on it. The old German shepherd walking quietly beside her. His muzzle had turned silver over the years. A faint scar crossed the bridge of his nose. His left ear no longer stood completely upright. His gait had slowed with age, but it still carried the unmistakable discipline of a soldier who had spent years following orders without hesitation. His name was Duke. To the hospital staff, he was simply the therapy dog. To Emily, he was the last living promise she had made to her husband. As they reached the employee entrance, Duke suddenly stopped walking. Emily didn't tug the leash. She never had to. Instead, she simply waited. The old shepherd stared at the gray steel door leading to the employee corridor every morning, without fail. He stood there for almost 30 seconds before taking another step. Most people thought it was just one of his odd habits. Emily knew better. 8 years earlier, another man had walked through a door almost identical to this one, Navy SEAL Chief Petty Officer Ryan Carter. Emily's husband, Duke's handler. Ryan had scratched Duke behind the ears before boarding a military transport for what was supposed to be a routine overseas mission. "I'll be back before you know it, buddy." It was the last command Duke ever received from him. Ryan never came home. For nearly 3 months afterward, Duke waited outside Ryan's empty kennel every single morning. He refused food, ignored commands, barely slept. Military veterinarians feared the decorated working dog was dying from grief. Until one woman quietly walked into the kennel carrying Ryan's folded American flag. Emily, she didn't speak. She simply sat on the concrete floor beside Duke for almost 2 hours. Neither of them moved, neither of them cried, neither of them had any tears left. When Emily finally stood to leave, she felt something warm against her hand. Duke had placed his head in her palm. It was the first time he had willingly touched another human since Ryan's funerals. Yet, every morning, he still paused before every employee entrance, as though a part of him still believed his handler might walk through one of those doors smiling. Emily gently rested her hand on his neck. "I know," she whispered. "So do I." Duke blinked once, then quietly continued inside beside her. No one noticed the small ritual, no one except Martha Jenkins, the 72-year-old volunteer who had worked the hospital information desk for almost 20 years, smiled as she watched them pass. He still waits, she murmured softly. Emily smiled sadly. He probably always will. Martha nodded. Some hearts never really retire. Duke walked through the lobby greeting people the way he always did, not with excitement, with quiet dignity. He stopped beside a frightened little girl waiting for surgery. She couldn't have been older than 6. She hugged a stuffed rabbit so tightly that one ear had almost come loose. The little girl noticed Duke first. Her anxious expression softened. "Can I pet him?" Emily knelt beside her. "If Duke says yes." The little girl giggled. "How do I know?" Emily smiled. "Hold out your hand." The child did exactly that. Duke slowly sniffed her tiny fingers, then gently rested his chin against her knee. The girl's shoulders relaxed almost instantly. For the first time that morning, she smiled. Her mother quietly wiped away a tear. "Thank you." Emily shook her head. "Thank him." The little girl hugged Duke's neck for only a second before hospital staff called her name. As she walked toward surgery, she looked back and waved. "So long, soldier." Duke watched until she disappeared through the hallway. Only then did he continue walking. Several nurses smiled as he passed. One of the residents laughed. "I think Duke's already treated more patients than I have today." Another doctor smiled. "He usually does." Not everyone shared that opinion. From the second-floor balcony overlooking the emergency lobby, a man in an expensive navy suit watched the entire interaction with folded arms. Richard Lawson, Jefferson Memorial's new executive director. He had been in charge for exactly 18 days. In those 18 days, he had noticed one thing that made him deeply uncomfortable: a large German shepherd roaming one of the busiest hospitals in Virginia. He didn't see comfort, he saw liability. He didn't see trust, he saw risk reports, insurance claims, potential lawsuits. He turned toward his assistant. "Schedule a meeting with Nurse Carter." "When this morning?" His eyes never left Duke. "It's time that dog retired." Emily had heard variations of that sentence before, not always spoken aloud. Sometimes it came in careful smiles, sometimes in nervous glances, sometimes in polite questions from visitors. "Isn't he a little big for a hospital? What if he scares someone? Are you sure he's safe?" She never argued. She simply smiled and let Duke answer those questions himself. Within 5 minutes, he always did. At precisely 8:10 that morning, a message appeared on her pager, executive director's office. Emily looked at it for several seconds. Officer Miguel Alvarez noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" She slipped the pager back into her pocket. "I've been called upstairs." Miguel sighed. "So, it's finally happening." Emily forced a smile. "I suppose so." Miguel looked toward Duke. The old shepherd lay peacefully beside the nurse's station while a little boy quietly read him a dinosaur book. "He doesn't deserve this," Emily answered softly. "No, but hospitals change." Miguel folded his arms. "Not always for the better." Emily clipped Duke's leash onto his faded leather collar. "Come on." The shepherd immediately stood, even at nearly 11 years old. His movements remained disciplined, never pulling, never wandering. He simply matched Emily's pace exactly. Several staff members watched them disappear into the elevator. No one spoke. Somehow, everyone knew why they had been called upstairs. Richard Lawson's office overlooked the city skyline. Everything inside reflected order: perfectly aligned folders, perfectly polished desk, perfectly centered certificates. Emily quietly knocked. "Come in." Lawson stood. "Please have a seat." Emily remained standing. "I'd rather stand." He nodded. "As you wish." His eyes shifted toward Duke. The old shepherd calmly sat beside Emily's chair. Silent, Still watching, Lawson opened a folder. I've reviewed hospital policies. Emily didn't interrupt. I've also reviewed our insurance requirements. Still, she said nothing. And unfortunately, he folded his hands. Animals are no longer permitted inside the emergency department. Silence. Only the quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the office. Emily had expected the words. They still hurt. I understand. Lawson seemed almost surprised. You do? I understand your responsibility, she smiled sadly. But I'd like you to understand mine. He waited. Emily looked down at Duke. He isn't here because I couldn't leave him home. He isn't my pet. He isn't a mascot. Lawson remained expressionless. Emily continued. For 6 years, I've watched children stop crying because he sat beside them. I've watched veterans speak for the first time in months because he quietly rested his head on their knee. I've watched families take their first deep breath after hearing impossible news because he reminded them they weren't alone. She looked directly into Lawson's eyes. I know policy. I also know healing doesn't always come from medicine. For the first time, Lawson hesitated, not because he disagreed, because she wasn't arguing. She was simply telling the truth. Still, he slowly closed the folder. My decision stands. Emily nodded once. Then today will be our last day. The words surprised him. Our? If Duke can't work here, she smiled gently. Neither can I. Lawson blinked. You'd resign? I made a promise. What promise? Emily looked at Duke. When I adopted him, I promised he'd never again wonder why someone he trusted disappeared. The room became very quiet. He lost one partner already. I'm not becoming the second. Lawson stared at her. He had expected anger, an appeal negotiation. Instead, he found quiet loyalty. It unsettled him more than any argument could have. Emily unclipped her hospital identification badge. She placed it carefully on the polished desk. I'll finish today's shift. After that, she smiled politely, I'll clear out my locker. She turned. Come on, Duke. The old shepherd immediately stood. As they reached the office door, Lawson spoke again. I truly am sorry. Emily paused. Without turning around, she answered. I believe you. And that's what makes this so sad. Then she quietly walked out. The news spread through the emergency department with astonishing speed. Hospitals had a way of carrying stories faster than elevators. By lunchtime, almost everyone knew. Duke was leaving. Emily was leaving with him. Nobody wanted to believe it. Dr. Lisa Monroe found Miguel Alvarez beside the coffee machine. Tell me, it isn't true. Miguel looked down. I wish I could. A respiratory therapist shook her head. My daughter asks about Duke every time she visits. Another nurse whispered, What are we supposed to tell the pediatric unit? Across the hall, an elderly volunteer quietly removed a framed photograph from the reception desk. It showed Duke wearing a tiny red Santa hat during the hospital Christmas party. She gently wiped away a tear before placing it inside her drawer. I can't look at this today. Only Duke seemed completely unaware. He spent the afternoon exactly as he always did. He greeted children, sat beside anxious spouses, walked quietly with veterans beginning physical therapy, accepted gentle pats from nurses finishing exhausting shifts. He wasn't saying goodbye. He didn't know there was anything to say goodbye to, and somehow, that made it hurt even more. At 3 o'clock, Emily received permission to leave early. She walked toward the staff locker room carrying a small cardboard box. Inside were 6 years of memories, a coffee mug from her first Christmas at Jefferson Memorial, a faded photograph of Ryan in uniform, a handwritten thank you card from a teenage cancer patient. A tiny blue ribbon tied by a little girl who had once whispered to Duke, "You make hospitals less scary." Emily carefully folded the ribbon and placed it inside the box. She looked at Duke. He sat patiently outside the locker room, exactly where Ryan had taught him years ago. Never enter unless invited. Always wait. Always watch. Always protect. Emily knelt beside him. "We're almost done." She scratched gently beneath his collar. "You've been such a good partner." Duke leaned against her shoulder. For a long moment, neither moved, neither realized. Across the lobby downstairs, a black SUV had just pulled quietly beneath the hospital entrance. An elderly man stepped out slowly, leaning on a weathered wooden cane. He wore faded blue jeans, a gray windbreaker, an old baseball cap with no military insignia. To everyone passing by, he looked like just another aging grandfather, arriving for a medical appointment. No one gave him a second glance. No one. Except Duke, the old German shepherd, suddenly lifted his head. His ears, dulled by age, rose as high as they could. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply stared toward the entrance with an intensity Emily hadn't seen in years. Almost as if, somewhere beneath the scent of rain, disinfectant, and city traffic, he had recognized something impossible. Someone he never expected to smell again. Duke didn't blink. The bustle of the emergency department seemed to disappear around him. Wheelchairs rolled past. Suffragettes moved through the automatic doors. Phones rang. Someone laughed near the nurse's station. Yet the old German shepherd noticed none of it. His entire attention remained fixed on the elderly man slowly making his way across the lobby. Emily followed Duke's gaze. "What is it?" The shepherd didn't move. That alone made her uneasy. In 6 years together, she had learned every one of his habits. If he saw food, his ears twitched. If he saw children, his tail wagged gently. If he recognized another veteran, he usually walked over after looking to Emily for permission. This was different. He stood perfectly still. His breathing had slowed. Almost as though years had suddenly fallen away. The elderly man paused near the reception desk. He smiled politely at Martha Jenkins. "I have an appointment with cardiology." Martha adjusted her glasses. "Of course, sir." She began typing. "Your name?" The man removed his cap. "Thomas Hale." Martha searched the computer. "Mr. Hale, there you are." She smiled warmly. "You'll need the elevators on your left. Thank you." He started walking. Then, halfway across the lobby, he stopped, not because someone called him, because he felt something, a feeling he hadn't experienced in almost 9 years, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by a working dog slowly, very slowly. He turned. Across the crowded emergency department, his eyes met Duke's. Time seemed to stop. Emily felt the leash become slightly tense in her hand. Not because Duke was pulling. Because every muscle in his body had become alert. The old man whispered something almost too quietly to hear. "No." His weathered face changed completely. Disbelief, hope, heartbreak, all at once. He took one cautious step forward, then another. His breathing became uneven. "It can't be." Emily looked from the stranger to Duke. Neither of them seemed aware anyone else existed. Officer Miguel Alvarez noticed the silence first. He looked up from the security desk. "What are they looking at?" No one answered. Even Martha stopped typing. Doctors walking through the lobby slowed. Something invisible had filled the room. Something impossible to explain. The old man continued walking. Not quickly. Carefully, almost afraid that if he hurried, the moment might disappear. When he was about 15 feet away, Duke did something Emily had never seen before. The old shepherd slowly stood. Then, Without waiting for permission, he took 3 deliberate steps forward. Emily froze. Duke? He ignored her, not out of disobedience, out of certainty. Every person who knew Duke understood one thing. He never ignored Emily, never. Until now. Officer Alvarez quietly whispered, "Something's wrong." Emily's heart began to race. No, something wasn't wrong. Something was happening. She simply didn't understand what. The elderly man stopped a few feet away. His eyes had become glassy. His hands trembled slightly against the cane. For several long seconds, neither man nor dog moved. Then, the stranger spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just above a whisper. "Easy." Duke's ears lifted instantly. The old man's voice cracked. "Shadow 6. Emily frowned. Shadow 6? She had never heard those words before. The lobby remained completely silent. The man swallowed hard, then finished the sentence. "Easy, Shadow 6. Stand easy." The effect was immediate. Duke's entire posture changed. His head lowered. His ears relaxed. His tail gave one slow, uncertain wag. Emily felt tears prick her eyes before she even understood why. The old man knew him. Not Duke. Shadow 6. A name Emily had never heard. Not once. Not in military records. Not from Ryan. Not from anyone. The elderly man's knees almost gave way. He caught himself on the cane. "My God," he whispered. "You remembered." Duke slowly walked the remaining distance. Every step seemed filled with recognition, with memory, with years that words could never describe. When he finally reached the old man, he didn't bark, he didn't jump. He simply pressed the side of his graying face gently against the man's chest. The cane slipped from the stranger's hand and clattered softly across the polished floor. Neither of them noticed. The old man's arms wrapped around Duke's neck. His shoulders began to shake. He wasn't crying loudly. He was crying the way soldiers often do. Silently. As though they had learned long ago to grieve without making a sound. Emily stood frozen. She had never, not once, seen Duke embrace anyone like this. Not even Ryan's parents. Not even her. The old man buried his face against Duke's neck. "I thought they told me you were gone." His voice broke. "I've been looking for you for years." Every conversation in the emergency department had stopped. Nurses stood in doorways. Doctors lowered patient charts. Families looked on in complete silence. Even Richard Lawson, looking down from the second-floor balcony, after hearing the unusual stillness below, stepped closer to the railing. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see something extraordinary, a decorated military dog, crying in the arms of a man no one recognized. And for the first time since arriving at Jefferson Memorial, Richard Lawson realized there was an entire story standing in his hospital lobby. A story no policy manual could ever explain. Nobody moved. It wasn't the kind of silence created by fear. It was the kind that falls over a room when everyone instinctively realizes they're witnessing something deeply personal. The old man's hands rested against Duke's shoulders. He closed his eyes for a long moment, breathing slowly, as though trying to convince himself this wasn't another dream. When he finally looked up, he noticed Emily standing only a few feet away. She wasn't jealous. She wasn't offended. She was simply confused. More confused than she'd been in years. The old man gently stroked Duke's graying muzzle, then looked at Emily. "You must be Emily." Her heart skipped. "You know my name?" He smiled sadly. "I've known your name for a very long time." Emily stared. "I'm sorry. I don't believe we've met." "We haven't." He nodded. "But your husband talked about you constantly." Everything inside Emily seemed to stop. The lobby around her faded into the background. "You knew Ryan?" The man's eyes softened. "Knew him?" A quiet smile crossed his face. I watched him become one of the finest SEALs I ever commanded. Emily's breath caught. You were. He extended his weathered hand. Retired Master Chief Thomas Hale. I commanded Ryan's unit. Emily slowly shook his hand. Her fingers trembled. For 8 years, she had imagined meeting someone who had served beside Ryan. She never thought it would happen in the hospital where she worked. And she certainly never imagined Duke would recognize him before anyone else. Officer Miguel Alvarez quietly leaned toward Martha. Who's Ryan? Martha whispered. Emily's husband. The one who... She couldn't finish the sentence. Miguel slowly nodded. Oh, now he understood, at least. He thought he did. Thomas looked back at Duke. You've got an old partner. The shepherd blinked slowly. His tail swept gently across the floor. Thomas laughed through watery eyes. So have I. Several people smiled. The emotion in the room became lighter, warmer. For a brief moment, then Thomas noticed something around Duke's neck. Not the faded leather collar. The small silver tag attached beside it. He leaned closer. His smile slowly disappeared. His fingers gently touched the engraving. He read the words twice, almost unable to believe them. Retired. He whispered the word, then looked at Emily. When? 6 years ago. She answered quietly. He was medically retired. Thomas nodded slowly. I should have known. Emily frowned. What do you mean? His eyes never left Duke. We lost contact after. He stopped himself. Emily noticed. After what? Thomas looked away. For the first time since entering the hospital, his confidence seemed to disappear. I promised myself, if I ever found him, I wouldn't tell that story. Emily's voice became almost a whisper. What story? Thomas remained silent. Duke gently nudged the old man's hand, almost as though reminding him he wasn't alone anymore. Thomas closed his eyes. I suppose he's waited long enough. Emily's heart began beating faster. Waited? For what? Richard Lawson had quietly come downstairs. He stopped several feet away, not wanting to interrupt, but unable to walk away. Doctors, nurses, security officers, patients. No one left. No one checked their phones. Every person in the lobby felt the same thing. There was something important about to be revealed. Something much bigger than a retired military dog. Thomas slowly picked up his cane, then looked around the crowded emergency department. So many people know Duke. Emily smiled. They love him. Thomas nodded. I can see that. Then he looked directly at Richard Lawson. You must be the hospital director. Lawson stepped forward. I am. Thomas studied him quietly. Were you planning to remove this dog from the hospital today? Lawson hesitated. Yes, Thomas simply nodded. I understand. The answer surprised everyone. Lawson himself looked confused. You understand? I understand responsibility, Thomas said calmly. I spent 34 years making impossible decisions. He smiled faintly. But before you make this one, I think you deserve to know who you've been asking to leave. Lawson folded his hands. I'm listening. Thomas looked toward Duke. The old shepherd had not taken his eyes off him once. You all know him as Duke. He paused. In the teams, we knew him as Shadow 6. Several veterans in the waiting room exchanged glances. That wasn't an ordinary name. Military working dogs assigned to elite units were often given operational call signs rather than names. Emily felt another question growing inside her. You called him that earlier, Thomas nodded. Because that was the last name he ever answered to. Emily whispered, Ryan never told me. He couldn't. Thomas answered gently. Much of their work remained classified. Emily lowered her eyes. She had always accepted there were pieces of Ryan's service she would never know. But standing here, watching Duke recognize a forgotten call sign after nearly a decade, made her realize how much history still lived inside the old shepherd. History no one had ever shared. Thomas slowly rested one hand on Duke's shoulder. Then he looked back at Emily. What I'm about to tell you isn't the story of how Ryan died. Emily's eyes filled with tears. It's the story of why he lived long enough to come home and marry you. The entire lobby froze. Emily's lips parted. She couldn't speak because for 8 years, she believed she already knew Ryan's story. Now she was learning. She had only ever been told the ending. Emily couldn't breathe, not because she doubted Thomas, because every anniversary, every folded flag, every military letter, every official report she had received over the last 8 years suddenly felt incomplete. She had always believed she knew Ryan's final chapter. Now, an old soldier was telling her she had never heard the beginning. Thomas looked around the silent lobby. I don't usually talk about missions. His weathered voice remained calm. Most of them stay where they belong. He gently rested his hand on Duke's neck. But this one belongs to him. He nodded toward the old German shepherd, and to Ryan. No one moved. Even the emergency department seemed quieter than usual. A nurse reached over and silently lowered the television volume in the waiting room. Someone switched a ringing cell phone to silent. Children stopped whispering. It felt less like a hospital and more like a church. Thomas spoke softly. 9 years ago, our platoon was operating in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. The mission wasn't unusual. Court reconnaissance. Return before sunrise. He smiled faintly. At least, that's what we thought. Emily listened without blinking. Every word mattered now. Ryan was leading the point element. Thomas continued. Duke, he looked down affectionately. Shadow 6 was 10 yards ahead, as always. The old shepherd's ears twitched, almost as if fragments of those distant nights still lived somewhere inside him. We had been walking for nearly 4 hours. The mountains were quiet, too quiet. Thomas's expression darkened. Ryan suddenly raised his fist. Everyone in the lobby instinctively imagined the scene. Moonlight, silence, a patrol stopping in complete darkness. Thomas continued. No one spoke. No one moved. We trusted Ryan, and Ryan trusted Shadow 6. He looked toward Duke. Then, he did something he'd never done before. Emily felt herself leaning forward. He refused to move. A puzzled murmur spread through a few listeners. Thomas nodded. Military working dogs don't ignore commands. They're trained not to. Ryan quietly whispered, Forward. Thomas swallowed. Shadow 6 didn't move. Emily looked down at Duke. The shepherd remained completely still. Thomas continued. Ryan tried again. Forward. Nothing. The dog stood like stone. Richard Lawson folded his arms. Even he couldn't look away now. Thomas smiled sadly. I remember Ryan shaking his head. Come on, buddy. Come on, Pritchin. Let's go. Again, the dog refused. For the first time in 6 years, Emily realized she wasn't hearing a story about a military dog. She was hearing a story about a soldier who had made an impossible decision. Thomas looked toward the hospital ceiling as though watching the memory unfold again. Ryan stepped forward himself. The moment he did, Shadow 6 grabbed the back of his vest. Several people gasped softly. Emily covered her mouth. He grabbed him? Thomas nodded. And pulled. He had never done that before. Never. Thomas looked directly at Richard Lawson. If a military working dog breaks years of training, you don't correct him. You pay attention. The room remained silent. Thomas's voice grew quieter. Ryan immediately ordered everyone to stop. We searched the trail. He paused. It took That's nearly 15 minutes. Emily whispered, "What did you find?" Thomas closed his eyes. A pressure plate. Silence, buried beneath loose gravel. One more step, and 30 pounds of explosives would have killed every man in that patrol. The lobby became so quiet that the distant beeping of cardiac monitors echoed down the hallway. Thomas looked toward Duke again. He didn't save one soldier, he saved 14. Emily felt tears rolling freely now. For years, she had known Duke was brave. She had never known how brave. Thomas smiled through moist eyes. When we finally got back to base, Ryan sat beside Shadow 6. He wrapped both arms around him, and he laughed. Thomas chuckled softly at the memory. He said, "Buddy, you just made 14 wives very happy." Several nurses quietly wiped away tears. Officer Miguel Alvarez looked down at the floor. He suddenly understood why Duke always watched families so carefully. Perhaps, in his own way, he had spent the rest of his life making sure no one else had to receive the kind of knock on the door that every military family fears. Emily whispered, "Ryan never told me." Thomas nodded. He couldn't. The mission remained classified. He simply told everyone, "The dog earned his dinner tonight." A few people laughed gently through tears. "That sounds like Ryan," Emily said. Thomas smiled. "It does." Then, his smile slowly disappeared. There was something else. Emily looked up. "What?" Thomas became quiet again, much quieter than before. The old strength in his voice gave way to something heavier, something that had clearly been carried for years. The mission where Ryan he couldn't finish. Instead, he looked at Duke. The shepherd slowly stood, walked closer, and gently rested his head against Thomas's knee. The old SEAL closed his eyes. "You still remember," he whispered. Then he looked at Emily. "The last mission was different." His voice cracked. "We all came home." Emily frowned. "What?" Thomas nodded slowly. "We all survived." Confusion spread across every face in the lobby. Richard Lawson looked bewildered. "So, if everyone survived," Thomas took a slow breath. "Ryan didn't die overseas." Emily stared. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She had always believed the military deployment had taken her husband. Thomas met her eyes. "No," he said quietly. "The war didn't take Ryan." His next words landed like thunder in the silent hospital. The hardest battle of his life didn't begin until after he came home. Every person in the emergency department stood frozen, even Emily, because she suddenly realized everything she believed she knew about the man she loved was about to change. Emily couldn't make sense of the words. The hardest battle didn't begin until after he came home. She stared at Thomas. "No," she whispered almost instinctively. "There must be some mistake." "The official report." Thomas nodded gently. "The report wasn't a lie. It simply wasn't the whole story." Emily felt her knees weaken. Officer Miguel Alvarez quietly pulled a nearby chair toward her. She didn't notice. Her eyes never left Thomas. "I was there," he said softly. "I attended Ryan's retirement ceremony. I stood beside him when he took off his uniform for the last time." He smiled. Thomas smiled sadly. He even joked that he was finally going to learn how to sleep. A few quiet laughs rippled through the room. Then Thomas's expression changed. But the war didn't stay overseas. He slowly moved closer to Emily without being asked. He rested his head against her leg, exactly the way he always did whenever painful memories surfaced. Emily's fingers instinctively found the old shepherd's fur. She barely realized she was stroking him. Thomas noticed. "He still does that." Emily looked up. "What?" "He always knew before anyone else. When Ryan's nightmares were coming, Shadow 6 would quietly lie beside the bed." Emily's eyes widened. You knew? Thomas nodded. Ryan called me one night, he said. Thomas smiled faintly through misty eyes. Chief, I think my dog knows my mind better than I do. Emily closed her eyes. She remembered. There had been nights Ryan would wake before dawn, walk silently into the kitchen, sit alone with a cup of coffee. Before Emily even realized he was gone, Duke would already be lying at his feet. She had always thought it was coincidence. Now, she knew it wasn't. Thomas continued. Ryan tried very hard to protect everyone around him. He wanted you to believe he was okay. Emily whispered. He always told me he was fine. I know, Thomas answered. He told us the same thing. He smiled. He laughed. He coached Little League. He volunteered. He looked exactly like the man everyone hoped he'd become. Thomas paused. But inside, he was still carrying the mountains. Nobody in the lobby spoke. Several veterans quietly lowered their eyes. They understood some battles leave no visible scars. Thomas looked toward Richard Lawson. I've buried men. I've written letters to families. But watching one of your strongest warriors slowly convince himself that everyone else would be happier without his pain. He shook his head. That was the hardest command I ever failed to give. Emily felt tears stream freely down her face. I wish he'd told me. Thomas looked at her with kindness. He wanted to. He simply didn't know how. Richard Lawson spoke for the first time in several minutes. What about Duke? Thomas smiled gently. What about him? You said the dog knew. Thomas nodded. He always knew. He looked down at the old German shepherd. The last morning I saw Ryan alive, Shadow 6 wouldn't leave the front porch. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Ryan had a medical appointment, Thomas answered. He walked toward his truck. The dog blocked the driveway. Emily looked at Duke. He blocked him? Twice. Thomas nodded. Ryan laughed. He scratched behind his ears and said, Come on, partner. I've got to go. Thomas swallowed hard. The dog wouldn't move. He simply stood there, watching him. Emily felt her chest tighten. What happened? Thomas looked away for several seconds. When Ryan finally drove away, Shadow 6 sat at the end of the driveway. He watched until the truck disappeared. He stayed there for almost 6 hours. The lobby fell silent again. Thomas looked at Duke. When the police arrived later that afternoon, he already knew. Emily covered her mouth. No, Thomas nodded. No one had said a word. No one had come home. No one had explained anything. But somehow, he knew his best friend wasn't coming back. Emily leaned against Duke. The old shepherd immediately shifted closer to support her, exactly as he had done hundreds of times before. Only now, she finally understood why. He hadn't simply comforted her after Ryan's death. He had been grieving too. A small voice broke the silence. It was the little girl with the stuffed rabbit. She tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. Mommy? Yes, sweetheart. Who's taking care of Duke? The question echoed through the lobby. Nobody answered immediately. Then Emily looked down at the old shepherd. She smiled through tears. I am. The little girl tilted her head. But who takes care of you? Emily opened her mouth. No words came. Because, for the first time in years, she realized the answer had been standing beside her all along. Duke had every single day. Whenever she cried without telling anyone, he stayed close. Whenever she skipped lunch after a difficult shift, he nudged her hand until she stopped working. Whenever anniversaries became too painful, he quietly rested beside her without asking for anything. He hadn't only been healing strangers, he had been quietly saving her too. Thomas watched the realization cross her face. Then he smiled. Ryan worried about leaving you alone. He worried every day. Emily looked at him. He told me something a week before he died. Thomas rested one hand on Duke's shoulder. He said, "Chief, if anything ever happens to me, I don't want people taking care of Shadow 6. Thomas's voice broke. He looked at the dog, and then he smiled. Shadow 6 will spend the rest of his life taking care of Emily. Emily could no longer hold back her tears. She wrapped both arms around Duke's neck. The old German shepherd leaned gently into her embrace, not like a trained military dog, not like a therapy animal, like family. Across the emergency department, there wasn't a dry eye to be found. Even Richard Lawson quietly removed his glasses, because at that moment, everyone finally understood something that no policy manual could ever measure. Duke had never come to Jefferson Memorial looking for a job. He had come to keep the final promise he had ever made to his best friend. And he had never broken it. For several long moments, no one in the emergency department spoke. Emily remained on her knees, her arms wrapped around Duke's neck. The old German shepherd closed his eyes. He didn't move. He simply rested against her, with the quiet patience that had defined his entire life. It felt as though 8 years of unanswered questions had finally found a place to rest. Then Thomas took a slow breath. "There is one more promise." Emily looked up, her eyes still wet. "What promise?" Thomas hesitated. "I've carried it for too long." His voice had changed. This wasn't the steady confidence of a retired SEAL. This was an old friend finally laying down a burden. "I should have kept it sooner." Emily slowly stood. "What are you talking about?" Thomas reached inside the inner pocket of his faded jacket. Everyone instinctively leaned forward. Richard Lawson, Officer Alvarez, Martha, the nurses, even the families waiting in the lobby. Thomas carefully removed a worn leather envelope. Its edges had softened with age. The flap had been opened countless times, then closed again. He held it with both hands for several seconds before looking at Emily. "Ryan gave this to me." Emily stared at the envelope. "He asked me," Thomas swallowed, "that if he ever couldn't give it to you himself, I would." Emily felt the room disappear around her. "What is it?" "A letter," Thomas answered quietly. "He wrote it 3 weeks before his final deployment." Emily's voice trembled. "I never knew." "You weren't supposed to," Thomas replied. "He planned to hand it to you himself after retiring." His eyes filled with regret. He always thought there would be more time. Emily reached toward the envelope, then stopped. Her hand hovered in the air, almost afraid to touch it. Thomas gently smiled. "I think it's finally time." He placed the envelope into her trembling hands, across the front. In Ryan's unmistakable handwriting were 6 simple words. "For Emily, only if I'm gone." Emily's knees nearly gave way again. She recognized every curve of the handwriting, the way Ryan always crossed his T, the slight slant of every Y. She had seen that handwriting on birthday cards, lunch notes, anniversary letters. For one impossible second, it felt like he was standing beside her again. She carefully opened the envelope. Inside, folded with military precision, was a single sheet of paper. She looked toward Thomas. "I don't know if I can." Thomas smiled gently. "You don't have to read it alone." Emily looked down at the paper, then quietly unfolded it. The room remained completely silent. Her voice shook as she began. Emily stopped immediately. Ryan had always called her that, never Emily. Always my M. She took another breath, then continued. "If you're reading this, it means life didn't go according to my plan." A few quiet tears appeared throughout the lobby. "First, please don't waste your time being angry. I know you'll try. You always pretend you're tougher than you really are." A tiny laugh escaped Emily despite herself. Ryan always teased her exactly that way. Second, I need you to make me one promise. Don't spend your life standing still because mine ended too soon. Emily's voice cracked. Duke quietly pressed against her side, almost as though he remembered these words too. Laugh again. Travel. Eat terrible roadside pie. Watch sunsets. Dance even when nobody's playing music. And please, don't let our dog become lonely. Emily stopped reading. She looked down at Duke. Tears rolled silently into his fur. Thomas quietly smiled. I told you, he was always thinking about both of you. Emily nodded, unable to speak. She continued reading. Shadow 6 won't understand where I went. He'll probably wait. He always waits. When he does, sit beside him. You don't have to fix anything. Just don't let him wait alone. There wasn't a dry eye left in the emergency department. Officer Alvarez quietly turned away. Martha removed her glasses. Even Richard Lawson lowered his head. Emily's voice became barely audible. One more thing. If he ever stops protecting you, then you'll know he's finally forgiven me for leaving. Emily couldn't continue. She buried her face against Duke's neck. The old shepherd gently licked the tears from her cheek. Thomas quietly finished the final lines from memory. I've read them so many times, he admitted. I'll never forget them. His voice softened. Until then, trust him. He sees things long before people do. He's the bravest soul I've ever known. Take care of each other. I'll be waiting for both of you. Love, always. Ryan. Silence, not uncomfortable silence, sacred silence. The kind that follows words spoken straight from the heart. After nearly a minute, the little girl with the stuffed rabbit slowly walked toward Emily. She held something in her tiny hands. It was the blue ribbon that had come loose from her rabbit's ear. She carefully tied it around Duke's faded leather collar, then she smiled. So he knows he's loved here too. Emily knelt and hugged the little girl. Thank you. The child looked up at Duke. I think he misses his best friend. Emily gently stroked Duke's silver muzzle. He always will. The little girl nodded thoughtfully. That's okay. Everyone looked at her. My daddy says, when someone loves you forever, they never really leave. The emergency department fell silent once again. Sometimes, the deepest truths arrive in the smallest voices. Across the lobby, Richard Lawson quietly wiped away a tear before anyone noticed. For the first time in many years, he wasn't thinking like an administrator. He was thinking like a father, like a son, like a human being. And he suddenly realized, removing Duke from the hospital wouldn't simply send an old dog home. It would break the final promise of a man who had already sacrificed everything. Richard Lawson looked across the emergency department for the first time since becoming executive director. He wasn't seeing policies. He was seeing faces. Nurses quietly wiping away tears. Doctors standing shoulder to shoulder with receptionists. Veterans holding each other's gaze. Children smiling at an old German shepherd whose greatest act of heroism, at least inside these walls, had never been chasing danger. It had been carrying grief day after day, without asking for anything in return. Lawson slowly walked toward Emily. His polished shoes echoed softly across the tile floor. Everyone watched. Emily gently folded Ryan's letter and placed it back inside the worn envelope. She looked up. Lawson stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he quietly removed the hospital policy folder he had been carrying all morning. Emily recognized it immediately, the folder that had ended her career. Lawson opened it, looked down at the neatly printed documents, then closed it again. I owe you an apology. Emily shook her head. You don't owe me anything. I do, he answered. I judged Duke without ever asking who he was. He looked toward the old shepherd. And more importantly, I judged him without seeing what he was already doing. He slowly tore the first page from the folder, then another, then another. The crisp sound of paper echoed through the silent lobby. Several employees exchanged surprised glances. Within seconds, the entire policy packet lay in pieces inside a nearby recycling bin. Lawson smiled faintly. I don't think we'll be needing that version anymore. A few quiet laughs broke the tension. Emily couldn't help smiling too. Lawson looked toward Thomas. Master Chief, Thomas nodded. Sir, I've spent the last 18 days trying to make this hospital safer. Thomas smiled. That's a good goal. It is, Lawson admitted, but today I realized safety isn't only about removing risk. He looked around the lobby. It's also about protecting hope. No one spoke. He turned toward Duke. I've watched dozens of people smile because of him. I've watched children become brave. I've watched veterans stand a little taller. And today, he smiled gently, I watched an old soldier keep a promise that lasted longer than most careers. He took one slow breath. I almost took that away. Officer Miguel Alvarez folded his arms proudly. Glad you noticed. A ripple of soft laughter spread through the room. Lawson actually laughed. So am I. Then he looked toward Emily. He hesitated. If you'll allow me, I'd like to make this right. Emily waited. Lawson reached into his jacket pocket. He removed Emily's employee identification badge. The very badge she had left on his desk less than 2 hours earlier. He held it out. I don't want Nurse Emily Carter to resign. Emily looked at the badge, then back at Lawson. What are you asking? I'm asking. He smiled. If you'll come back to work tomorrow. Emily laughed softly through tears. I never actually left. The emergency department erupted into warm laughter. Lawson nodded. Good. Then I suppose I don't have to rehire you. He wasn't finished. He turned toward everyone gathered in the lobby. I'd like everyone to hear this. His voice carried clearly across the emergency department. Effective immediately. Duke is welcome anywhere in this hospital that Emily and the medical staff determine is appropriate. Applause immediately filled the lobby. Children clapped enthusiastically. Nurses hugged one another. Even physicians who normally avoided emotional displays smiled openly. Lawson raised one hand. That's only temporary. The applause quieted. Tomorrow morning, I'll recommend to the hospital board the creation of the Ryan Carter Military Working Dog Compassion Program. Emily's eyes widened. The what? Lawson smiled. I think your husband deserves to have his name remembered. He looked toward Duke. And I think his partner deserves to keep serving. Thomas quietly lowered his head. Ryan would have hated the attention. Emily laughed. He absolutely would. Thomas grinned. And then he'd secretly brag about Duke for the next 10 years. Even Duke's tail thumped gently against the floor, as though he somehow understood everyone was talking about his best friend. Just then, a soft voice echoed from behind them. Excuse me. Everyone turned. The elderly veteran, whose medal Duke had found earlier that afternoon, had slowly walked into the lobby with the help of his grandson. His breathing was stronger now. His color had returned. He smiled warmly at Duke. I heard that a hero was about to lose his job. Emily smiled. Not anymore. The veteran nodded approvingly. Good. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket. I've carried this for nearly 40 years. From inside, he carefully removed a small challenge coin. Its edges were worn smooth from decades of handling. On one side, an American flag on the other. The words "Leave no one behind." He knelt with surprising effort before Duke. I've only given one of these away before. He gently placed the coin beside Duke's front paws. I think you've earned mine. Duke lowered his nose, carefully sniffed the coin, then looked back at the veteran, without hesitation. He gently rested one paw over it. The old veteran smiled through tears. I knew you would understand. Thomas quietly chuckled. They always do. Across the room, Richard Lawson noticed something remarkable. Nobody had told Duke to place his paw there. Nobody had trained that moment, yet somehow, the old shepherd had understood exactly what was being offered. Not a toy, not a reward. Respect from one soldier to another. Richard felt something shift inside him. He had spent years believing leadership meant writing better policies. Today, a retired military dog had taught him that leadership sometimes meant knowing when to rewrite your own heart. As the afternoon sunlight poured through the emergency room windows, Duke quietly sat beside Emily once more. Exactly where he'd always chosen to be. Watching, protecting, waiting. Still keeping a promise made by a man whose voice he would never hear again. Yet whose mission he had never forgotten. And somewhere deep inside that old German shepherd, the waiting no longer felt quite so lonely. For a long while, no one hurried back to work. Hospitals are places where every second matters. But every so often, life creates a moment that deserves all the time it asks for. This was one of those moments. Then, almost reluctantly, the familiar rhythm of the emergency department returned. A trauma pager sounded somewhere down the corridor. An orderly hurried past with a wheelchair. A physician was called to radiology. Life, as it always did, kept moving. Emily wiped the last tears from her cheeks and clipped Duke's leash back onto his collar. Come on, partner. The old German shepherd stood. His joints were stiff now. Ames had made sure of that. But there was something different in the way he walked. The uncertainty that had followed him all afternoon had faded. Almost as if a weight he had carried for years had finally become lighter. Not gone, just lighter. Thomas noticed it too. He smiled quietly. You've been waiting to hear Ryan's voice again, he whispered to Duke. I think today, you finally did. Duke looked back at him. His tail gave one slow wag. 3 days later, the conference room on the hospital's 4th floor was completely full. Board members, department chiefs, legal advisors, risk management, nursing supervisors. Usually, meetings like these were dry, filled with budgets and compliance reports. This meeting began differently. Richard Lawson walked to the front carrying no policy binder. Only a small remote. He pressed one button. The projector illuminated the screen. Instead of financial charts, an old photograph appeared. It showed a much younger Ryan Carter sitting on the ground in desert camouflage. Beside him, a young military working dog with bright ears and alert brown eyes. Shadow 6. Neither of them looked at the camera. Ryan was laughing. The dog was looking up at him as if nothing else in the world existed. The room became quiet. Lawson spoke. This is why we're here. No graphs, no spreadsheets, no legal language, just one photograph. He spent the next 20 minutes telling the board everything he had witnessed, not dramatically. Simply truthfully, how children smiled, how veterans trusted Duke, how families calmed, how nurses found comfort. How one retired SEAL commander had recognized a forgotten hero. When he finished, nobody spoke immediately. Finally, one board member adjusted her glasses. Richard, how much will this program cost? Lawson smiled. It will. A few people laughed. But I'd like to ask a different question. He looked around the table. How much does hope save? Silence. Another board member slowly leaned back. My grandson spent 2 weeks in pediatric oncology. he quietly admitted. There was a golden retriever that visited every Wednesday. His eyes became moist. I don't remember the doctor's name. I barely remember the medication. But I still remember that dog. The room remained silent, one by one. Others began sharing their own stories. A nurse whose father had recovered after visiting with a therapy dog. A surgeon whose daughter overcame a fear of hospitals because of one gentle Labrador. A trustee who admitted that after his wife died, the only thing that convinced him to attend grief counseling was the presence of a retired police K9. For the first time in years, the meeting wasn't about numbers. It was about people. The vote was unanimous. Not one person voted against it. The Ryan Carter Military Working Dog Compassion Program officially became part of Jefferson Memorial Medical Center. Richard Lawson quietly smiled. He knew exactly who deserved the credit. 1 month later, the hospital held a small ceremony in the main lobby. Emily almost refused to attend. Ryan had never liked ceremonies. Neither had Duke, but Thomas convinced her. He'd tease us all day, then secretly treasure every second, Emily laughed. That's exactly what he'd do. Children lined the hallway holding tiny American flags. Veterans arrived wearing old unit caps. Doctors stood beside nurses. Housekeeping staff stood beside administrators. No reserved seating, no special treatment. Just one hospital, together. Near the entrance stood a bronze plaque covered by a navy blue cloth. Richard Lawson stepped to the microphone. I've given hundreds of speeches, he admitted. I've never been more honored than I am today. He looked toward Emily. Some heroes wear white coats. He looked toward the veterans. Some wear uniforms. Finally, he smiled at Duke, and some wear fur. Soft laughter spread through the crowd, Lawson continued. This hospital has always believed in healing. But healing isn't only surgery. It isn't only medicine. Sometimes, it's quiet loyalty, it's presence, it's hope. He gently invited Emily forward. Would you help us? Emily nodded. Together, she and a little girl from pediatric oncology pulled away the cloth. The bronze plaque caught the morning sunlight. It read, The Ryan Carter Military Working Dog Compassion Program dedicated to every military working dog whose service continued long after the battlefield, in honor of Chief Petty Officer Ryan Carter, and Shadow 6, known here simply as Duke, because courage doesn't retire. The applause lasted nearly a minute, not because of the plaque, because of what it represented. Promises kept. Sacrifices remembered. Love that refused to disappear. Thomas quietly stepped toward Duke. He reached into his pocket one final time. This time, he removed something no larger than a thumbnail, an old military identification tag. The edges were scratched, the lettering faded. He knelt. I've carried this since your retirement, he whispered. I think it belongs with you again. Emily looked closely. Stamped into the metal were simple words. Shadow 6 Thomas clipped the tag beside Duke's faded leather collar. For a brief moment, the old military dog wore both names, the one given to him in war, the one given to him in peace. Shadow 6, Duke, neither name was more important than the other. Together, they told the story of his entire life. Thomas gently rested his forehead against Duke's. Mission complete, partner. The old German shepherd looked up at him, then, for the first time anyone could remember, Duke gave a playful little wag that traveled through his entire body. Not the polite wag he offered strangers. Not the restrained wag of a disciplined working dog, the joyful wag of someone who finally understood. He hadn't failed his handler. He had fulfilled every promise Ryan had ever asked him to keep. Emily watched quietly. then looked toward the bright morning sky beyond the hospital entrance. She smiled through happy tears. "You were right, Ryan," she whispered. "He took care of me." A gentle breeze drifted through the open doors. The small blue ribbon tied around Duke's collar fluttered beside the old military tag, past and present, side by side. As patients continued walking through the emergency room doors, many paused to pet the old German shepherd before beginning what was often the hardest day of their lives. Duke greeted every single one with the same calm kindness. Not because he had been trained to, but because, after a lifetime of service, compassion had simply become who he was. And somewhere beyond what any of them could see, perhaps one Navy SEAL finally smiled, knowing that the two souls he loved most had found exactly what he had hoped for all along, a way to keep living together.